Okay, so this is part 3 of the week 6 SOCA1010 lecture on youth, and in this section I'll be concentrating on talking about what's become known as the study of youth transitions. Youth studies historically has largely looked at, on the one hand, youth transitions, on the other hand, youth cultures, and more recently those two traditions have kind of come together a lot more, I think, to think about young people's lives more in a more whole kind of way. But certainly youth transitions, I think, has been one of the key ways of thinking about this kind of more social and economic aspects of young people's lives. So as I said in the first part of the lecture, the very idea of youth is this kind of transitional period from child to adult. And there's been a couple of key texts in particular that are kind of now part of the canon of youth studies that argued that young people, I suppose, are particularly a good thing to study in terms of understanding that kind of connections between social inequalities, things that often stay quite similar, and social change, the way that kind of as generations and time advances, as people are born into the world, they face sometimes very different economic, cultural, political and social circumstances. So the two key texts, I think, if you're interested in looking at youth studies in more depth, it's certainly Furlong and Cartmel's work, Young People and Social Change, that was originally written in the late 90s and was kind of updated throughout the early 2000s. And in Australia, the book Rethinking Youth by Joanna Wynne and Rob White, the two really key texts that were the genesis of the field overall. In terms of youth transitions, there's kind of 3 interconnected things that are kind of studied under that kind of umbrella, I suppose. There's school to work transitions, that kind of way that we, go to school, go to high school, then when high school finishes, young people need to make choices. Do they study more? Do they go into work? What kind of work is available? What are the conditions of the labour market? So that's kind of the school to work transition stuff. There's domestic transitions, and it's the way that young people will get into relationships and, whether they get married or stuff like that. And then there's housing transitions, the ways that young people move out of the family household, either into their own places, their own apartments, into share housing, and things like that. Traditionally, I think this kind of transitional period from child to adult was kind of seen as being quite linear. You would go to school, you would leave school, you would get a full-time job, you would, meet your partner, you would settle down and have kids and buy a house, all that stuff relatively early. Often having all those boxes ticked by the time you're 30. Much of the research over the past 30 years has shown that is not really the case anymore. And I'll go into some of the reasons about that why in a minute. But really this kind of transition is no longer seen as linear, much more blurry, much more as a zigzag. And the social research that youth studies people do bears out the evidence of this. So there's numerous reasons why this is more blurry, more of a zigzag kind of transition. People are in education for more and more, longer and longer. There's been upward credentialising of the labour market where in previous generations, jobs that you could have just got or gone to TAFE for require now university education. There's increased life expectancy, things like birth control and marriage and stuff like that are happening later, often connected to economic circumstances as well. There's the rising house prices where it's much more difficult for young people to get into their own market, which means they tend to rent or live at home with parents or with families or whatever for longer if they're lucky enough to have those. And there's the labour market in general that's basically become much more precarious. The actual numbers of full-time jobs are constantly dwindling. More and more people are in short-term work, casual work, zero contract work, and now we have the rise of what's called the gig economy. So youth studies has tended to show how that transition from child to adulthood, those markers of being an adult, leaving home, getting a full-time job, getting married, having kids, they're not happening, in the mid-20s as much anymore. In fact, they're moving out into 30s, late 30s, 40s. In fact, more and more people are not kind of ticking those markers off at all. So really we then need to think about, what is the idea of an adult then? If you haven't got your own house and you haven't got kids, and, does that mean you can be like a 40 or a 50-year-old youth? And so there's lots of interesting conceptual debates in youth studies about that kind of stuff. But essentially, moving into the full-time labour market much later, getting married and having kids much later, and often staying at home, living with families, mum and dad or whatever, for much longer as well. So there's a link here to some stats from the ABS that kind of is a good summary of a lot of this. You can see some increased medians here for the first marriage, childbearing, leaving the house, increased rates of higher education, much higher rates of women in the workforce, much higher rates of part-time work, and less identification with organised religion, and much decreasing rates of full-time work. So I'll just get you to pause now and click on that link and have a look at that. So conceptually speaking, we have these kind of terms to think about what's happened to youth transitions. They're zigzag, they're fractured, they're blurry, but particularly the research in the 90s and early 2000s showed that the young people at that time were experiencing these kind of changes as they were happening, and there was lots of mental health issues and stuff around it. Increasingly, though, today young people expect much more uncertainty in the labour market. It's become the norm in that sense. Young people in this generation, so previous generation at least, are socialised into much more uncertain, precarious labour markets, so it becomes the norm. Young people are also, couples are having fewer children, having them later in life, and this all relates, I think, a lot to some of the moral panics around young people. As social change happens, and young people tend to bear the brunt of it and are at the kind of vanguard of social change, older people who are kind of, socialised with a different set of norms are often, have more secure existence, tend to then look back at their own lives and at current young people and judge the current generations as being in deficit or something. But really what's happening here is that young people face a very different world than their parents and their grandparents and have to make choices based on very different economic, political, social, labour market kind of circumstances. And so this seems to be the basis for much of that kind of intergenerational conflict that I spoke about in the first half of the lecture. Sorry, the first third of the lecture. So what have been the social changes? Well, there's been kind of, huge kind of falls in full-time work. There's been a whole bunch of restructuring of the labour market since the kind of late 70s, early 80s. And recessions and stuff like that played a role. Certainly kind of globalisation plays a role that we'll look at in a few weeks, where particularly manufacturing work was relocated to the developing world. Of course, there's more opportunity for exploitation over there in terms of making things cheaper. And this saw a whole bunch of what was kind of, mostly working class work disappear out of the Australian economy. So you can see that's been out in the numbers there, that, in 88, almost 2/3 of young people between 15 and 19 were in full-time work. But 10 years later, only 1/3 of were. So this happened really quickly in the 90s as those kind of huge economic changes happened. At the same time, there's been a huge rate of widening participation in the higher education, which is obviously a great thing for many young people. But this obviously has an effect on that kind of transitional thing as people study for longer and longer and get into the workforce later and later. What's also a problem here too is the labour market and the skills needed in it are kind of regenerating so quickly that often the things that young people study for aren't all that relevant by the time they reach the labour market. So there's kind of often a disconnect between education systems and what's happening out there in the real world. So sociologists have been particularly interested in coming up with kind of analyses of these changes, those kind of broad economic, social and political changes that I was just talking about. So what I'd like to do now for a few minutes is talk about some sociologists who have been writing, extensively about these huge changes that connect to globalisation. They've been writing since the 80s, people like Ulrich Beck in particular, others like Giddens and Bauman and stuff like that, but I'll mostly concentrate on Beck's work here, who come under the different kind of labels of things like reflexive modernity theorists or late modernity theorists. And then what they're interested in is how these kind of global changes have had huge influence on the way that we live, fundamentally changed our own subject positions in the world, and in particular how the very concept of risk becomes a key organising principle. So Beck coined the term risk society. His book was written in the 80s and that came out around the time of the huge Chernobyl disaster. And he proposed basically that we now don't so much live in a class society anymore, that we live in a risk society. Importantly, he talks about how class and risk kind of map on to it in a way. If you have more money, you can be kind of insulated from many risks. But for the first time in human history, really, according to Beck, there's now these huge global scale risks that break that kind of connection between class and safety, I suppose. Things like nuclear fallout, things like genetically modified food, things like terrorism, things like climate change can affect all people because they're such huge things that break boundaries. If you're if you live in a global city and you work in a kind of multi-story building, if you're kind of a rich CEO that works in the top of the building, or if you're kind of poorer cleaner of the building, you're still all breathing in the same smog when you're in the city. So Beck kind of uses this idea that smog is democratic, that it breaks across these borders, and therefore these huge global, quite often environmental risks affect everybody. Now there's lots of debate about that, and I would argue as a class theorist, and people argue as gender and theorists and race and ethnicity theorists, that Beck's been too general there, but overall you can see what he's talking about, that these huge new risks affect us all in some way or another. You can't just avoid them because you're rich, or because you're male, or because you're white. So what this means for Beck is that essentially societies become increasingly organising around risk and our orientation towards it, and this means that our individual choices become more and more important. And I'll get to aspects of that in a minute. Importantly for Beck, and for this risk society perspective, what these huge risks have kind of engendered is that we now have a kind of different orientation towards things like knowledge and the concept of truth. So whereas, in previous centuries, religion, provided the populace with their truth, then along came the Enlightenment, and, things like science started to kind of provide us with truth. For the kind of position that Beck's talking about, Beck argues that today that we kind of know that science has produced all these wonderful forms of progress, in inverted commas, but at the same time, this progress has actually provided all this kind of collateral damage, these risks that were, the ones I was talking about before, climate change and all this kind of stuff. So for Beck, that means we no longer sort of have a kind of total trusting relation with science, that we just kind of trust it to provide us with truth and knowledge, and we kind of, even as individuals and in our day-to-day lives, have an understanding how there's so much information out there that kind of we get conflicting things all the time. And for Beck, this means that, individuals now live in a kind of uncertain, precarious orientation towards the world, that they're concerned with risk, yet they're bombarded with multiple kinds of conflicting informations, and therefore it's up to the individual to move through the world, make decisions, make the right choices to minimise risks in their lives. So this has kind of threatened all kinds of collective meanings that I'll get to in a little bit more in a minute. But you can think about this, in everyday kind of examples. For a long time there was kind of stories on the news. One day there was a glass of red wine is a day is really bad for you, and you might be an alcoholic if you do that. The next day, if you have a glass of red wine once a day, it's good for your circulation or whatever. You can chocolate's good for you one day and bad for you the next. All these kind of different conflicting things we get about risk, and we're left in this kind of sea of uncertainty. So risk therefore becomes a kind of key way that we orient ourselves towards the world, and politics in particular becomes more about organising risk and minimising risk, or at least inflicting risks on some people over others. And you can particularly see these in politics around if wherever someone needs to dump some nuclear waste or medical waste, or someone wants to build a new tip or something like that. One of the things that these theorists are interested in is what that means for the individual, and I'll come back to that in a minute. This is particularly around the idea of what's called individualisation. They argue that these kind of changes over the past couple of decades have driven us to kind of face the world more as individuals, and this obviously coincides with kind of neoliberalism as well, but it's not the same thing. Beck and Giddens and Bauman talk about this process of individualisation where collectives become dissolved or more blurry. Things like the nuclear family, things like class and stuff like that are kind of less ways that we think about ourselves in our day-to-day life, and we're more left to create our kind of self-identity through this process of consumption in particular, and making the right choices. So it's up to us to kind of look around at those around us and measure ourselves towards other people, try and make the right choices to become the person you want to become. But obviously, the very ability to make the right choices is correlates a lot to one's position in social space, whether they're a rich white male or a poor black female. These things have a real kind of influence on just whether you can make the right choices or not. And this kind of fundamentally challenges the very idea of choice, and shows that our choices we make aren't often choice, just easy as that, just free choices, that they're related to all these other kind of discourses. So for Beck in particular, he argues that we move towards what he calls a reflexive position. People are more and more reflexive. They're in the world where they kind of have to manage themselves by constantly reflecting on how they are, in relation to others, and reflecting to make the right choices to, try and have the future that they want in this kind of, sea of uncertainty. So reflexivity here is like a feedback loop, constant self-questioning and self-surveillance. It happens at a micro level where we kind of, do it through our consumption choices, in our search for what Giddens calls ontological security, a kind of safe and secure sense of self. But it also happens on a kind of, macro level as well, where, science itself has to produce more knowledge and, more processes to reflexively try and minimize the risks that science has produced in the past. So I spoke about an example of, what this means in the first lecture when I was talking about asbestos. A form of science produces this great thing to build houses out of. Later on, another form of science comes along and finds that it gives people cancer. Then companies try and hide that from people to continue to make profit. And then, another form of science then has to deal with that form of cancer and try and, save people or make their lives livable. And then another comes along and has to kind of deal with the waste and find somewhere for it to live. You can see here that the idea of progress there, that science produces progress, is somewhat kind of mitigated by that. Really you could argue there that this is stuff to make houses of that didn't produce progress, it actually produced risks. So what does this mean in terms of young people's lives? Well, they're born into a kind of risky, uncertain world, and they're left as individuals to largely make the right choices in that transitional period. And it's in those transitional periods where those choices that you make are very important to your future, but also there's kind of a whole bunch of pressure put on young people at the same time to make the right choices. So that transitional period from that kind of more secure period of being a child, where you kind of don't have a lot of responsibilities and you're looked after by other people, to the where you're kind of totally independent, that being adult, that kind of transitional period between those two things is obviously a really interesting thing to look at in terms of these broader social changes, because young people have to deal with them, so much. In relation to this, Giddens and other theorists have argued that what this has meant is society's gone through a process of detraditionalisation, and this is another thing that kind of threatens those kind of former certainties. A withering away of old forms of social collectivity and associated norms of behaviour. So you don't necessarily have as a stronger relationship here with kind of place, kinship, religion, social class, or even gender. For the likes of Giddens, each phase of transition tends to become an identity crisis. The self becomes a reflexive project to be consciously worked on. Now, one of the things that Giddens points out there in terms of how this kind of process of detraditionalisation, on the one hand, and how we're faced, how we have to face it as individuals, is the rise of experts in day-to-day life that we kind of hire or look to give us advice. People like personal trainers and beauticians and life coaches and all these kind of things. The whole industries around this kind of reflexive project that we kind of hire various experts to help us make the right decisions and to live a healthy life or whatever. But again, at the same time, while we're doing that, we also know that kind of much of the stuff that, and much of the information that comes out through these so-called experts tends to be sometimes dubious, and you have the rise of things like, weird diets where you kind of, I don't know, only eat bacon for 2 weeks or something, and then, anti-vaxxers and all this kind of stuff, where, again, there's this kind of, blurriness between what experts tell us and, what the information we take on and how we live our lives. And this, again, seems to kind of create a constant self-fulfilling prophecy of risk and uncertainty in our lives. So what this means for youth studies is that, where things like subcultures and stuff like that were a way of thinking about the collectivity of young people, youth transitions researchers tended to focus more on the individual, or at least, how kind of people from particular backgrounds will be facing this transitional period. So we see this kind of notion that youth transitions are being individualised. Each young person must now create a successful life trajectory because it's no longer spelled out for them as it was in traditions of the past or for previous generations. And I think this kind of, makes a lot of sense. I mean, in the 70s or 80s, if you were a young white male growing up in Cessnock, you pretty much were either going to, work in the coal industry or maybe in the wine industry, but there wasn't a lot of other options, and that was just kind of the normal thing that people did. Today, I think people that are born in particular positions aren't necessarily playing out those roles as much anymore. But that's not to say that the same kind of inequalities don't still exist at the same time. So again, there's a kind of, this transitional period is a really good thing to look at in terms of thinking of how, traditional inequalities still really intensely matter in terms of who can do what, but also how these social changes change the way that those things work as well. So here's the idea that reflexivity becomes the norm for everybody. It's not just kind of middle-class people that have more freedom to be reflexive and be able to put their life into order. People from disadvantaged backgrounds in some senses need to be even more reflexive again, because not only are they under pressure to make all the right choices, but they tend not to have the capacities or the things needed to do that because of those unequal systems. So youth studies has kind of, I think, theorised a lot of this stuff quite well. Peter Kelly's work in particular has shown that young people are kind of constantly under these kind of double standards. Of on one hand, they need to be entrepreneurial and make all the right decisions and all this kind of stuff. Yet on the other hand, they're under constant surveillance and discipline to be a good citizen or be a good worker or be disciplined. So there's a kind of real playoff here with huge demands on young people from a really early ages to make the right choices. Also with the kind of moral panicky kind of negative representations of them. So again, Peter Kelly's work in particular I think is a really good thing to look at in terms of the way that there's all these both conflicting demands and discipline put on young people to make the right choices and to do these things. In Australia, in the Youth Research Centre in Melbourne, there's been a study called the Life Pattern Study. It's been going since the 90s. It's been tracing and following in this longitudinal manner some from young people throughout that period. And it's been like a huge influence on the field. So if you want to have a look at that, there's a link to a research report there. And I'll be talking in a minute about the Newcastle Youth Studies Group, and 3 of our members, Julia Coffey, Julia Cook and David Ferrugia, all began their research careers in that centre. So that's been headed by Joanna Wynne, who I was talking about earlier on, and it's been a kind of really influential study on the understanding of young people's lives and those statistics I was talking about earlier on in terms of the decreasing this and increasing that. There's lots of statistics about that, but there's some also really good qualitative aspects on those studies as well that flesh out that quant data with the way that young people make decisions with their emotions and how they try and live the life that they want to live. So the youth transitions research has been, I think, profoundly important for thinking about the way that inequality works and the way that social change happens. As I mentioned earlier on, there's been kind of 2 traditions, cultures and transitions. Youth studies, transitions tended to focus on work and education, opportunities, deviance and risks in that sense. But like youth cultures tended to study on the leisure practices and consumption and pop culture. Today, there's been a kind of attempt to bridge that gap in many ways because it's no real good studying one or the other because those things are, heavily interrelated. We know that, a lot of the things that young people do in their youth cultural kind of leisure stuff is done because of stuff that's going on in the kind of, say, the more youth transitions path, I suppose. So increasingly there's a lot of study that kind of brings this stuff together that I think is really important. So there's bridging the gap between these things. Youth transitions needs to incorporate youth culture because young people's experiences with culture is the actual area in which they seek to cope with and at times defy the ups and downs of those structural transitional changes. So there's some really good stuff about that, and there's a good collection edited by Dan Woodman and Andy Bennett that does that quite well. And you can see the research I'll talk about in a minute in our youth studies group tries to do that as well. If you've been interested in this topic about youth this week, there's a whole course on it that you can do online only. It runs in second semester, and that's some of the things that we look at there. It's largely a course that presents the research that our Newcastle Youth Studies Network does. And so if you're interested to do that, the SOCA1010 is a really good prerequisite for it. You don't have to have done this subject to do it. It's kind of set for a quite general audience across the university. And that's some of the things that we go into there. And if you're, again, interested in this topic, you can check out the research that myself and the members of our group do. So overall, just to kind of recap, in the first part of the lecture, I gave a broad introduction to youth, this kind of transitional liminal period between a child and adult. Thought a little bit about generations, and those conflicts that happen and moral panics, the way that old people seem to constantly start denigrating young people, even though they went through the same process when they were young as well. The second part, I looked at kind of understandings of youth cultures, particularly the Birmingham school that pointed out that, not all pop culture and consumer culture practices are, that kind of Frankfurt School cultural dupe or ideological, that there's autonomous practices going on that, may be seen to express resistance or subversion. And in the last section, I was talking about the more economic and social kind of school to work transitional stuff, and how there's been some really interesting sociological work, kind of theoretical work around the notions of the risk society. It's been really important to thinking about that liminal period. How those huge social changes where it's argued that people in general are more precarious, more uncertain, more reflexive, engenders a kind of individualisation of our lives where we kind of are forced to make choices to try and construct our own self-identity as best we can. Yet at the same time, we know that there's kind of, we live in this uncertain time where many of the choices we make are, risky in the sense that we can't always have the true information to make those choices with. In general, this means that there's a kind of broader questioning of things like science and truth, and again, we're left as individuals to kind of deal with its precariousness. What this means overall is the youth transitions period is extending more and more, to the point where people are starting to very much question the very idea of the distinction between youth and adulthood, particularly if people increasingly aren't ticking off those ideas of what it means to be adult till much later in life, or sometimes not at all. Okay, thanks.